Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine, all one word, .co.uk. Enjoy. So Esther, thank you for joining us. We first spoke shortly after October the 7th last year. I think at that time you would not necessarily have anticipated that you would still be in a state of war a year later.
Absolutely not. I mean, although it's obviously dangerous to play the prophecy game, but no, I don't think anyone expected not only that we would still be at war in Gaza with Hamas, but that we would have effectively 6 other fronts that Israel was also fighting on.
It's worth just reminding listeners what the other 5 fronts are.
Right, so then there's Hezbollah in Lebanon, there's Syria, there's obviously Iran, which that's an unprecedented direct conflict there now. Yemen with the Houthis, Iraq with the Shiite militia, and an ongoing conflict in the West Bank as well.
So the first thing I think we would love to know as fellow editors is how you keep going. I mean, you've moved from one war to 6 wars. How does, Haaretz is a relatively small newspaper. The sheer stamina and exhaustion factor must be quite considerable.
That's very kind of you to think of us in those terms. It has been extraordinarily challenging, not least because this war, right from the very start, hit people in their personal lives as much as their professional lives as journalists. The events of October the 7th and ever since had deep personal ramifications for many of the people that work at Haaretz, both obviously in terms of family and friends within Israel, but also friends, family, and acquaintances in Gaza as well. So, yes, it's been really quite challenging. On the other hand, that's the work that we do. And it's our job. I think one of the other most difficult parts of it is that our job is to disperse the fog of war. And when there are so many conflicts in so many places, that also becomes much more complicated. It also becomes more complicated to separate out the immediate dramatic events that happen from a more analytical view of where it is going and what the significance of it is. I'll just give you an example. Literally half an hour ago here, there were 85 rockets that were fired from Lebanon onto Haifa, which is Israel's third largest city. Yesterday, in the Tel Aviv area, we had air raid sirens from Hamas rockets from Gaza, from Yemen's Houthis, and from Hezbollah, all in the space of one day, which was obviously also October the 7th, the first anniversary of the Hamas assault, which was in itself a very challenging day. So ability to not only report very, very carefully about what is happening at any particular moment in time, but also to try and maintain the capacity to understand it in a more analytical way, that is also that's a big mission and not simple to do.
I'd like to ask you about the coverage of the anniversary of October the 7th, and you kindly sent me a special project that is interviewing 9 journalists or asking them to write their stories about their experience on October the 7th. I personally found this very powerful, but tell us about it.
So we started thinking about how we could express to our readership not only what happened on October the 7th, but the journalistic challenge and personal challenge of covering those events. So we asked 9 Haaretz journalists, some of whom very veteran, some of whom had only come into their positions literally weeks before, to describe exactly what happened to them on October the 7th. Many of them went down south or were already based in the south of Israel. Some of them themselves became targets of the Hamas attack itself, whether or not they lived in communities that were actually under siege, or while they were in the course of their reporting came under fire. Others also were in contact with Palestinians in Gaza and were reporting from the sense of what was the reception of the Hamas assault there and what the expectations for what the repercussions would be. And it was a complicated piece to commission, partly because journalists, especially, I suppose all journalists, but particularly our journalists, don't want to be the headlines of the story. They want to be the ones who are reporting it, and that's where their main focus is. They're not interested in becoming the stars of the show. They're absolutely dedicated to try and bring the story to the reader. So there was a bit of persuasion involved, but I think it's a pretty unique behind the scenes view of how
let me just read that.
gets done.
Esther, let me just read a passage from Yaniv Kubovich, who is the Haaretz military correspondent. I mean, there are other passages that I could read that are, extremely, extremely powerful. But he describes going into the area where the terrorists were, and the cruelty was insane. The pictures were insane. The failure was so serious, the helplessness of the army, the confusion. No one could imagine anything like this, even in the most extreme military drills. And then he writes something, for me, quite extraordinary. He says, I realized this was also my responsibility, and I failed. I apologize that I didn't do more research, that I didn't present the reality in the field, that sometimes I didn't want to hurt the feelings of senior officers at your expense, that I didn't always come with a more critical eye. I mean, this is searing self-honesty. It's
And I would say, coming from Yaniv, who is someone, no matter what he wrote, and by the way, what he wrote there, he wrote in a tweet, so he sent it out to the entire world. It was not some kind of private confession. It was something that he wanted to make public. Haaretz in general, and he in particular, are not known to be, the kind of military correspondence or covering the IDF that cozy up to the military like some other outlets here. So there's no doubt that we always had a far more critical eye on some of the claims and policies of the IDF. But yes, that gives some sense of what a calamity it was on October the 7th and how it dispelled many, many preconceptions that people had here.
So can you describe for us Haaretz's position in the overall media ecosystem in Israel? From the outside, I have a feeling that much of the media has sort of clicked into Israel right or wrong gear, and that's understandable in a time of war. But that Haaretz has maintained a low, perhaps lonely and critical stance at a time when public opinion seems to be very volatile. We've had these huge demonstrations against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Is that perception right? Does it feel lonely being at Haaretz at a time of trying to tell your kind of truths in a time of war?
Well, I suppose in some ways Haaretz is used to not being flavour of the month or the year or the decade in terms of any particular government, or in many senses, quite a substantial proportion of the Israeli public. It is our mission to speak truth to power, and that's not always a particularly popular position to be in. But yes, there has definitely been a sense of mobilization of the mainstream media in terms of the war, and much more, I don't know about official suppression, but there's definitely pressure on media outlets from the public as much as anywhere else to play down critical dissenting voices. But as I say, we're not unused to that situation. There are certain points of view or stances that we take that definitely do have wide popular support. For instance, our criticism of the Netanyahu government and everything that led up to October the 7th and the management of the war. The majority of the Israeli public is still not convinced that this government is managing the war and in the correct way, certainly not happy with its abandonment of the hostages in Gaza for the sake of whatever other aims might be pushing their policy.
How is this translated into reader support? I mean, I'm trying to think of parallels in the UK. I mean, certainly on the Manchester Guardian during the Boer War, the reporters needed armed guards escorting them to work. They were so unpopular, the Guardian stance. And after Suez, famously, when the Guardian opposed Suez, there was an advertising backlash. But in these days, I don't know if it's about the advertising backlash, but have you seen subscriptions rise as people have swung in behind your journalism?
Well, certainly I can speak for Haaretz's English edition, its international edition that I edit. We've had an enormous rise in subscriptions, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the Israeli public, because that is a readership that is obviously spread around the world. But certainly the Hebrew edition of Haaretz has not suffered from some kind of boycott of any kind. But there is definitely, there's an atmosphere that the government would prefer dissenting voices to quieten down. It's already taken steps against international outlets that report in a way that it doesn't.
What did you make of the ban, the temporary ban on Al Jazeera in Ramallah and the West Bank?
Well, I think that there should be freedom of expression, and I think that foreign media outlets, even when they are reporting in a way that is confrontational or difficult to manage, still should have the capacity and freedom to report. Just as I think that it's still a major problem that there are no international independent sources of reporting from inside Gaza, and not really from South Lebanon either.
But there's been, obviously in the last 12 months, overwhelming focus on the destruction in Gaza and the attempted extirpation of Hamas and their leadership, and then in Lebanon, the successful targeting of Hezbollah commanders and Nasrallah, but very little about the West Bank. And it would be very useful, I think, for people to hear how Haaretz is covering what's going on in the West Bank. And is there restiveness in the Arab-Israeli population? What are settlers up to? Can you give us a brief picture?
Well, we have a full-time correspondent who covers everything that happens in the West Bank, and there has been a marked rise in settler violence against Palestinians. There's also been a rise in Palestinian violence, whether in retaliation to settler attacks or attacks from West Bank Palestinians within Israel as well. In fact, that just happened last week. 7 people were killed in Jaffa by 2 Palestinians from the West Bank in a terror attack. So there is definitely a rise in the level of conflict there. For the first time several months ago, the international community decided to take some notice of it in an official way and started sanctioning some of these more violent settlers. But all of this is happening in the context of a government that is extraordinarily supportive of settlement, some of whom have personal friendships and long histories with some of the instigators of this violence.
Well, I want to come back to Israeli public opinion. And obviously your job, and we understand it as fellow editors, is to follow the story, as you say, understand context, not just driven by the day or the need for clicks. We get that. But you are treading a quite difficult line, because when I talk to Israelis, as I do off and on, about what's going on, they keep saying to me, look, you have to understand that the majority of the population does support the war against Hamas, the retaliation, the overwhelming retaliation against Hamas for what they did on October the 7th. But they also, a majority of the population, actually want to see Bibi Netanyahu depart as prime minister. So these two things apparently going in the opposite direction. So tell us about that, and how do you parse it and how do you report it?
So this really is the paradox that we live in. We have a popular war or wars led by an extraordinarily unpopular leader. If we just remember before October the 7th, Netanyahu was facing almost a full-scale civic uprising because of anti-democratic legislation he was trying to pass. The country was absolutely split down the middle into fears of civil war, and his popularity in the half that opposed him was near zero. And then we got to the disaster of October the 7th, and his popularity ratings, went under the floor, if there was any way to do that. There was extraordinary public criticism of Israel's lack of readiness. And as time went on, his absolute resistance to taking any kind of responsibility, let alone blame, for what happened. But on the one hand, Netanyahu knew what he had to do was to ride it out. He knew that more time that passed between October the 7th and wherever he stood, the shattering calamity, the immediacy of it would fade to a degree. And honestly, there is significant amongst Jewish Israelis, because amongst Arab Israelis, the situation is a bit different. There is widespread support, certainly was for degrading Hamas's capacities in an absolute way in Gaza. Support for the war in Gaza is not so high now, but in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah, there is more or less wall-to-wall support. After all, this is the most serious hostile force on Israel's borders, and they do have the capacity to inflict enormous damage on Israel, and they are backed by Iran, which, has spent many decades funding and training what they hoped would be a way of encircling Israel with hostile proxies. So if you ask, Israelis do support trying to weaken the people who are sworn to your destruction, then unsurprisingly, the answer is going to be yes. The paradox, as I said at the beginning, is still that the level of trust in Netanyahu is very low, but he has played long game in some ways, and his popularity, even if it's not his personal popularity, but the polls show that his party are now doing much, much better than they ever had. In fact, in August, Likud, his party, topped the polls for the first time since October the 7th. So, he's always sold this story. He's always sold to Israelis the message that Israel is surrounded by implacable enemies. Only he can protect us. Now, obviously, that got an enormous, one would have thought, fatal blow from October the 7th. What has been Israelis' lived experience? They saw what implacable enmity, if not savagery, on October the 7th. And from October the 8th, they saw Hezbollah joining in the fight. So there's something thematic that he will succeed in always, because he appeals to and has always talked about that very, very deep fear. And as time goes on, he reaps the benefits of those. Now, in terms of, as I said, his management of the war in Gaza is not very popular, but as the fronts expand towards Lebanon and Iran, his poll success jumps each time. So when Iran sends a rain of missiles towards Israel,
This has happened
you
twice in the
win.
last 6
Right.
months.
And it's happened twice in the last few months. So that is the narrative that works for him.
Thank you.
Esther, you talked about the fog of war earlier. How reliable do you find the IDF and the Israeli government and spokesman in terms of speaking truthfully about what's going on in the war?
Well, they have first of all, the IDF and the government are not quite the same. The government doesn't, I mean, the government, let's say, a Netanyahu speech where he says, we're heading for total victory and this and that and that. Well, you can just, pigeonhole that in the kind of normal political demagoguery. Don't have to really, there's no way of, assessing its truthfulness. That's just politicking. In terms of the IDF, I would say that they have, I wouldn't say they had their own kind of truth, but they offer a limited set of facts, which generally are not wildly out of touch with what is actually going on, but it's from a very, very narrow point of view, and it can choose when to start its description of events and when to end them. So that is not perhaps the fullest way of understanding anything, but they are one input into our coverage.
Can we throw things forward? You've talked about the fact that nobody can get in, no media can get into Gaza at the moment. At some point, the shooting will stop and reporters will go into Gaza and they will find, we're led to believe, a picture of total physical devastation, and there will be heartrending stories. How do you imagine Israeli media will cover that, and what effect do you think that will have on public opinion?
That's really an excellent question. I would have liked to have thought that will give people reason to stop and think, and to understand what the scale of suffering and destruction has been on the other side. On the other hand, understanding something about human nature in these kinds of conflicts, up till now, I don't think either side really has extraordinary amounts of capacity for empathy with the other. Let's not forget, this is a two-way street as well. The latest polling of the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza, completely reject the idea that Hamas committed any war crimes itself. So, and there's very high support for Hamas. So the idea that demonstrating the results of what the army has done, when the vast majority of Israelis think that was one of the most just wars, at least in its initial stages, that Israel has ever undertaken. I don't know how much it will change hearts and minds, to be honest.
Esther, I hesitate to finish on a depressing note, but what's your best judgment? Does this continue to escalate, in particular Israel-Iran? Because Israel will strike back very soon.
Yes, it seems clear that Israel has no interest in letting things lie. It is still very much aware of how much deterrence it lost on October the 7th, and that cannot be a scenario that ever repeats, even in terms of Iran, which is obviously a far, far more serious foe. I've kind of got butterflies in my stomach thinking about how much worse it could get, but it can always get worse. On the other hand, we know that all conflicts in the end with some kind of diplomatic agreement of some kind or another. The question is a ceasefire of some kind.
Some point.
So the question is, does that come before or after X number of thousand people and more cities turn to rubble? I would say that, there is a problem from the start that the Israeli government did not have an end game, did not have a strategic idea of what was going to be the result of military force. There has to be some kind of civil government, some kind of way to understand how the conflict was going to be resolved. Obviously, this government has no interest in longer term ways to end the conflict in terms of a two-state solution. But it doesn't actually seem from the other side either that there is enormous interest in sitting down and saying, well, that's enough dead now.
We must let you get back to editing. Let's hope we're not here in a year's time still talking about this, but Haaretz has done an amazing job. I'm a happy subscriber and read it every day, and it's an amazing product. So keep going.